There's a moment, usually late at night, when your phone is face down, the room is quiet, and you catch yourself thinking about someone you haven't spoken to in hours, maybe days, maybe longer. And what's strange is not that you're thinking about them, it's the way your body reacts like they're still nearby. That slight tightening in your chest, that urge to check something you promised yourself you wouldn't check again, that quiet negotiation in your mind. Maybe just one look, just to see if they're online. I want to stay with that moment for a second, because this is where most men misunderstand themselves. They think it's about the person. But what I see after years of sitting with men in moments like this is something more uncomfortable. It's not just about who you're thinking about, it's about what that thinking is doing to you when no one is watching. Before we go deeper, if this kind of conversation feels like it's speaking directly to something you don't usually put into words, you might want to stay with me here. And if you find value in unpacking these quieter emotional patterns, go ahead and like and subscribe, not because you're being sold something, but because you're choosing to not ignore yourself this time. Now, let me tell you something most people won't say out loud. When you're stuck on someone, your mind doesn't just replay memories, it edits them. It smooths out the rejection, it amplifies the chemistry, it deletes the moments where things didn't feel good enough. And slowly, without realizing it, you start building a version of them that only exists in your internal world. Not who they are, but who your nervous system prefers them to be. That's why it feels so personal, because it is. Not because of them, but because of what your mind is trying to resolve through them. I've seen men convinced they're in love, when what they're actually experiencing is unfinished emotional tension. A loop. Something unresolved that keeps asking for closure but never quite gets it. And the hardest part? Your brain doesn't always want closure. Sometimes it prefers the chase, the uncertainty, the almost. Because certainty would force you to let go. And part of you doesn't want to let go yet. Not because they're right for you, but because the emotional pattern still feels alive. And that's where things start to get interesting and a little uncomfortable. Because if we follow this honestly, we might have to admit that the question was never really, what are they doing? It's, what is this doing to me when I'm alone with my thoughts? And that changes everything. But we're not done with this yet. You know what most men do at this point? They start building theories, not consciously, but it happens anyway. You replay conversations like they're evidence in a case you're trying to win. You zoom in on a text message like it contains hidden meaning. You reread a hey or a delayed reply, and suddenly it becomes a story about your value. And I want to be very careful here, because I'm not going to tell you that you're overthinking like it's something stupid or weak. That's not what this is. This is your mind trying to regain control over something that felt emotionally uncertain. But here's the quiet truth most people miss. You're not actually trying to understand them. You're trying to restore stability inside yourself. And the mind, when it can't get clarity from reality, will create its own version of it. That's where fantasy begins. Not fantasy like imagination in a harmless sense, but fantasy as emotional regulation. Let me say that more plainly. If reality feels inconsistent, your mind builds something consistent, even if it's not true. And that's where attachment becomes sticky, because now you're not responding to the person anymore. You're responding to your internal version of them, the one that always says the right thing at the right time, the one that still feels warm when everything else feels uncertain, the one that never fully rejects you because you keep rewriting the ending before it arrives. And I need you to notice something important here. The emotional pull doesn't always come from what they did. It often comes from what they didn't fully do. The unanswered message, the almost confession, the moment they were close, but not close enough. Psychologically, that in-between space is powerful. It doesn't resolve, it lingers, it loops. And your mind hates unfinished loops, so it keeps going back. Not because you're broken, but because your system is trying, incorrectly, to complete something that can only be completed externally, or sometimes not at all. And this is where I want to slow down with you, because there's a subtle shift that starts happening here that most men don't notice until much later. At first, you think you're thinking about them. Then you realize you're thinking about how you feel when you think about them. And eventually, you start to crave the feeling more than the person. That's the turning point. Because now, even if they were to disappear from your life completely, something in you might still reach for the emotional state they triggered. And that's when it stops being about connection and starts being about regulation. But there's something deeper still underneath this, and it has nothing to do with them at all. There's a part of this that men rarely talk about, even to themselves. It's not just longing, it's the way silence starts to feel like it has weight. You're sitting there, maybe doing something completely normal, working, driving, scrolling, and suddenly your mind drops back into them like it never left. And in that moment, it doesn't feel like memory, it feels like presence. That's what makes it so hard to explain to anyone else. Because on the outside, nothing is happening. But on the inside, something is very active. And I want to tell you something I've noticed over and over again. When a man is emotionally attached in this way, he often assumes the intensity means this must be important. But intensity is not the same as importance. Sometimes intensity is just nervous system activation with nowhere to go. Let me put that more simply. Your system is awake, but it doesn't know what to do with itself. So it attaches that energy to a person, a name, a face, a story. And then it feels meaningful, because now the energy has a target. But the target is not always the source. And this is where things start to get quietly distorted. Because once the mind assigns meaning, it starts protecting it. You begin to defend the connection internally, even if nothing external is actually happening anymore. You might say things like, "They just need time. They're busy." It's complicated. And maybe sometimes those things are true, but notice what's happening underneath those sentences. You're maintaining emotional continuity. You're preventing the story from ending too abruptly, because an ending would force you to feel the absence fully. And absence, when felt directly, is uncomfortable in a very specific way. Not dramatic, just quiet, heavy, unignorable. So the mind prefers movement, even painful movement, because movement feels like possibility, and possibility keeps the attachment alive. I want you to imagine something for a moment, not as a judgment, just as an observation. Imagine that the person you're thinking about is not actively doing anything right now. They're not sending signals. They're not pulling you closer. They're just existing in their own life. But inside you, the relationship is still active. That gap, that difference between external reality and internal activity, that's where most of the emotional strain lives. Not in what they're doing, but in what your mind is continuing to do with the space they left behind. And if we're being honest, that space often becomes a kind of private room you keep returning to. Not because it's peaceful, but because it's familiar. And familiarity can feel like connection, even when it's actually repetition. There's something you may not have considered yet. Sometimes what feels like attachment to a person is actually attachment to the emotional state you enter when you think of them. And once that state becomes familiar enough, you don't need them present to feel it anymore. You just need the thought. And that's where this becomes something deeper than attraction. It becomes internal conditioning. But we're still only scratching the surface of what this really is. Let me say something that might land a little differently than what you've heard before. There are moments when you don't miss the person. You miss the version of you that existed around them. Think about that for a second. The way you checked your phone a little more carefully. The way you paid attention to timing, tone, meaning. The way you became more alert, more emotionally tuned, almost like you were reading a language that only existed in that connection. And then, when it's quiet again, when they're not actively part of your day, something feels slightly off in you. Not broken, not dramatic, just less activated. And your mind, being very good at storytelling, assumes that activated means alive. So it starts reaching back, not always for the person, but for the version of yourself that felt sharper, more emotionally engaged, more something. This is where it gets psychologically interesting. Because the brain doesn't store relationships as clean categories like healthy or unhealthy, it stores them as emotional patterns: intensity, anticipation, reward, uncertainty, relief. And when those patterns repeat enough times, your system begins to recognize them as meaningful even without clarity. So now you're not just thinking about them, you're responding to a learned rhythm. The waiting, the hope, the slight disappointment, the unexpected moment of attention that resets everything again. It's a loop of activation and relief, and your mind remembers relief very well, maybe better than anything else. That's why even when things aren't good for you in a stable sense, part of you still returns. Not because you're choosing confusion, but because your nervous system is remembering resolution in small doses. And here's where I want to slow this down, because this is usually the part people miss entirely. If a connection creates just enough uncertainty to keep you engaged, but just enough reward to keep you hopeful, your system can start to treat that pattern like significance. Not love, not compatibility, significance. And significance is powerful. It doesn't ask whether something is good for you long term, it just asks, does this feel like it matters right now? But there's a cost to that. Because over time, your internal emotional baseline starts to shift toward unpredictability. Calm can start to feel unfamiliar. Stillness can feel like absence. And absence can feel like something is wrong, even when nothing is. So you go back mentally, again and again. Not because you're stuck on a person in the simple sense, but because your system is trying to re-experience a pattern it learned was emotionally important. And the hardest part? You can't think your way out of a pattern that was learned through feeling, which means something else has to change. And it usually begins in the place you've been avoiding the most. The quiet space where there is no message coming and nothing to decode. There's a moment I see men hit, quietly, almost without noticing it. It's not the moment they move on. It's the moment they realize they've been having a relationship in their mind that isn't being matched anywhere outside of it. No confirmation, no continuity, no shared reality, just internal continuation. And that realization can feel strangely hollow, because suddenly you're faced with a question that doesn't have an emotional answer, only an honest one. What exactly am I holding on to right now? And most men don't like that question, not because it's complicated, but because it removes the emotional noise that was making things feel meaningful. Let's sit with something subtle here. When someone is inconsistent, emotionally, communicatively, or simply in presence, your mind starts doing extra work. It fills gaps, it predicts, it interprets, and over time, that extra work can start to feel like investment, like effort equals depth. But effort in your mind doesn't always translate to reality. Sometimes it just means you've been alone with uncertainty long enough to start building structure out of it. And structure feels safer than emptiness, even if it's not real. I want to be very careful here because this isn't about blaming you for caring. It's about noticing how easily care can start to merge with interpretation. You begin to treat small signals like they carry emotional weight they were never actually meant to hold. A delayed reply becomes a story. A short message becomes a mood. A memory becomes evidence. And without realizing it, you start living in a layered experience. One layer is what's actually happening. Another layer is what you're building on top of it. And most of the emotional intensity lives in the second layer. Not reality, interpretation of reality. That's why it can feel so consuming. Because you're not just interacting with a person, you're interacting with a constantly updated internal model of them. And that model is shaped by your hopes, your fears, your timing, your loneliness, your expectations. Which means it's not neutral. It's emotionally charged. Now here's where things get a little uncomfortable. At some point, the mind prefers the model over the real thing because the model is more responsive. It appears when you think about it. It shifts when you feel differently. It gives you something to engage with even when the external world is silent. And that can create a strange dependency, not on the person, but on the mental engagement itself. So even when nothing is happening, something still feels like it is. And I want you to notice something very specific here. If your emotional experience depends more on what you imagine than what is actually being exchanged, then the relationship is no longer fully located outside of you. It has moved inward. And that means the most important part of this entire experience is no longer them. It's the space between your thoughts. Because that's where the loop continues, or finally starts to break. And in that space, something very honest begins to surface, if you stay with it long enough. There's a strange kind of silence that shows up when the mental noise finally slows down. Not the peaceful kind, the exposed kind. It's when you stop analyzing for a moment, and there's just a gap where the story used to be running. And in that gap, something else appears. Not clarity, not resolution, just awareness. And awareness, at first, doesn't always feel good. Because without the mental activity, you're left with what was underneath it all along. A feeling of wanting, a feeling of absence, a feeling that doesn't have anywhere obvious to go. And this is where many people rush back into thinking again, just to avoid sitting in that space for too long. Because thinking feels like control, even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. But I want to tell you something I've noticed in quieter moments of real change, not the dramatic kind, but the internal shift that happens almost invisibly. The moment a man stops trying to solve the emotional experience and instead starts observing it, something subtle begins to change in the way the experience holds him. Not immediately, not dramatically, but enough to notice that the intensity doesn't grip quite the same way it used to. And here's why. Most emotional loops depend on participation. Not action, participation. The rereading, the reimagining, the silent arguments in your head, the revisiting of what it meant. That participation is what keeps the loop alive, not the person, the engagement with the meaning. And when you withdraw that engagement, even slightly, something uncomfortable happens at first. The mind tries to pull you back in. It offers interpretations. It replays moments. It suggests explanations that feel urgent. Because from its perspective, disengagement feels like loss. But from a deeper perspective, disengagement is actually space. And space is something your system isn't used to when it's been trained on emotional stimulation that comes in waves. So at first, space feels like emptiness. But emptiness isn't absence of something real. It's absence of constant interpretation. And that's a very different thing. There's a moment I want you to imagine, not as a goal, but as a possibility. You think about them, and nothing unfolds after that thought. No narrative expands, no analysis begins, no emotional spiral starts, just the thought, and then silence. And in that silence, something important becomes visible for the first time. Not who they are, not what they meant, but how much of your attention was being carried by internal motion that you didn't notice was happening. And when that motion slows, you start to see the difference between feeling something and feeding it. This is where a lot of men quietly realize something they didn't expect, that the intensity they thought was connection was often sustained by repetition. And when repetition stops, what remains is not loss. It's unfamiliar stillness. And that stillness is not empty, it's just unfilled. Which means it can become something new, or nothing at all. And what it becomes depends less on them, and more on what you choose to do in the moments when your mind reaches for the old pattern again. I want to end this in a place that doesn't try to fix you, or close this neatly, because life doesn't actually work that way when something has lived in your mind for a while. So instead, I want to bring you back to something simple, right now. Not the version of you that's been thinking, replaying, analysing, just you, sitting there, aware. Because there's a difference between understanding something and interrupting it. Understanding happens in your head. Interruption happens in your behavior, even in the smallest ways. And what I've learned is that most emotional loops don't end because someone figures it out. They end when someone stops feeding them the same way. Not dramatically, not perfectly, just differently. And that difference often starts in moments you wouldn't think matter. The pause before checking, the breath before opening a message thread, the decision not to reinterpret something for the 10th time, the quiet choice to leave a thought unfinished instead of completing it into a story. These are small things, but they change the direction of your attention, and attention is what keeps everything alive. Now, I want to say something carefully here because I don't want to turn this into a motivational idea that sounds nice but doesn't touch reality. Letting go doesn't always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels like withdrawal, not because you're losing a person, but because you're losing a pattern your mind got used to using for emotional movement. That's why it can feel strangely empty in the beginning, not broken, just unoccupied. And unoccupied space can feel unfamiliar when you've been filling it for a long time. But that space is not something to rush past. It's actually where your nervous system starts to recalibrate without you forcing it, where your thoughts stop automatically reaching for the same emotional route, where the person you've been thinking about starts to lose a little bit of their internal weight, simply because you're no longer reinforcing them through repetition. And slowly, very slowly, something returns to you that you might not have realized you were losing. Not confidence, not clarity, but presence. The ability to be in your own mind without immediately being pulled into a story. And from that place, something very honest becomes possible. You start to see the difference between what felt intense and what is actually reciprocal. Between what was meaningful in your imagination and what is actually alive in reality. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because it shapes how you choose, how you attach, how you interpret silence, how you handle uncertainty. And maybe most importantly, how you treat yourself in the absence of certainty. So if you're sitting here still thinking about someone, I'm not going to tell you to force it away. That never works in the way people hope. But I am going to suggest something quieter. Notice what happens in you when you don't follow the thought all the way through. Notice the first moment your mind reaches for the familiar loop, and you don't fully go with it. Not as punishment, not as discipline, just as observation. Because in that small interruption, something begins to shift. Not in them, in you. And that is where this was always happening from the beginning.